Where Three Streams Meet, Celtic Spirituality by Sean O'Duinn, Order of St. Benedict. Introduction. Our purpose is to examine the traditional path to God which the Gaelic-speaking peoples of Ireland and Scotland evolved over the centuries. Remnants of this ancient heritage still remain, and when put into the wider context of the great family of the Celts, of which the Welsh and the Bretons form so important a part, we can arrive at some notion of a great spiritual heritage which, because of its special qualities, may speak to us in a compelling manner. Amidst the numerous works which have appeared over the past number of years on the various spiritual paths, a new emphasis was given to the Celtic way by Professor John Macquarie in his book Paths in Spirituality, Oxford 1972. He drew attention to the Gaelic tradition of piety, which stressed the presence of God in the world, filling everything, invigorating everything, and folding everything, while safeguarding the transcendence of God, that is, God as being utterly different from us or anything we can imagine, and being infinitely far away. The Gaelic-speaking peoples laid great stress on the immanence of God, the nearness of God to us, and his involvement with nature and with the world. In him we live and move and have our being, Acts 17:28. Generally speaking, the Church both in East and West has shown a tendency to stress the transcendence of God and emphasize his majesty and distance from us, with a consequent need to lay great stress on the means available in the Church to provide access to him. The transcendence of God is part of Christian belief and was held by the Celts, as with other Christians, as the magnificent text from the Irish Stowe Missal makes clear. It is truly meet and right, just and for our salvation, that we should here at all times and in all places give thanks unto thee, Holy Lord, Almighty everlasting God, through Christ our Lord, who together with thine only begotten and the Holy Ghost art one and immortal God, incorruptible and immovable God, invisible and faithful God, wonderful and praiseworthy God, honorable and strong God, most high and magnificent God, living and true God, wise and powerful God, holy and beautiful God, great and good God, terrible and peace-loving God, noble and upright God, not in the singleness of one person, but in the Trinity of one substance. We believe in thee, we bless thee, we worship thee, and we praise thy name ever, world without end, through whom is the salvation of the world, through whom is the life of men, through whom is the resurrection of the dead. West, 1938, page 78. On the other hand, as we shall see, native texts in Irish rather than in Latin tend to stress the immanence of God. Rinandul, the God of the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, the God who surrounds us. There was no difference in beliefs in this matter between the Celts and other Christians. Both parties held that God was both transcendent and immanent, as is necessary for orthodoxy, but the Celts tended to place particular emphasis on the immanence of God. This tendency to emphasize the nearness of God and his association with nature and with the events of everyday life had, naturally, repercussions on the Celtic way. What was important was to build up an awareness of the divine presence, to cultivate an intimacy with God, who is nearer to us than we are to ourselves, and this cultivation of awareness gave rise to the Paracadukes, or folk prayers, which are such an important part of Gaelic spiritual tradition. There was a prayer for rising, for going to bed, for blessing the bed, for milking the cow, for seeing the moon, etc. In other words, special prayers and rituals were used as a technique for building up an awareness of God. In this way, one became united to God, which is the aim of all forms of spirituality. Professor Macquarie puts the matter very succinctly, bringing together the archaic past and the present. And I doubt whether the quest for a vision of the world in a new wholeness and depth can be fulfilled unless we can realize again the presence of a transcendent reality that is nonetheless that which is nearest of all, immanent in the world and in human life itself. It may be worthwhile recalling this vision of the world and sense of presence that were once common in the West and are still common in parts of the world. The Celt was very much a God-intoxicated man whose life was embraced on all sides by the divine being, but this presence was always mediated through some finite, this-worldly reality. 1972, pages 122 through 123. We can distinguish several ideas in this quotation which help to introduce the subject. Firstly, the idea of quest for an understanding of one's place in the world and integrated life. Secondly, the idea of the divine presence immanent in the world and in human life. Thirdly, the concept of the divine immanence as having been lost in the West, but preserved in Celtic spirituality. To lead into an account of the Celts, their origins and way of life, we may pause for a moment to consider that strange episode described in chapter 17 of the Acts of the Apostles, in which St. Paul addresses the Athenians. While his speech was directed to the people of Athens, the religious ethos it ascribes to them comes remarkably close to that of the Celts. In the year 279 BC, the Celts had actually launched an attack on the sacred shrine of Apollo at Delphi, not so far away from Athens. So Paul, standing in the middle of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious, for as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all men life and breath and everything. And he made from one every nation of men to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their habitation, that they should seek God, in the hope that they might feel after him and find him. Yet he is not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, a representation by the art and imagination of man." Acts 17:22 through 29. St. Paul remarks on the religious zeal of the Athenians with their many shrines and an altar to the unknown God. According to a legend, a pestilence had broken out in the city several centuries before, and to avert the supposed anger of the gods, a flock of black and white sheep were set loose on the streets. Each sheep that lay down and dozed off in the sun was sacrificed. Barclay, 1955, page 143. St. Paul remarks that the Athenians were very religious. Similarly, Caesar says of the Celts of Gaul, "The whole Gallic people is exceedingly given to religious superstition." Tierney, 1960, page 272. The gods and goddesses of Ireland are well known, the country itself being named after the goddess Eru, while other goddesses' names are in common use. Names such as Ain, Una, Maeve, Fiona, Aeth, Lu, for which is derived Lugnasa, is perhaps the best known god, while Andagda and Angus Og are associated with Brunnaboyne, the great megalithic site in County Meath. As regards the view that God, being the creator of the world and all that is in it, does not live in shrines made by man, the Celts may have been nearer to Paul's view than the Greeks to whom we are speaking, as it appears that the oak grove or a clearing in a forest was the ideal setting for Celtic worship among the Druids. It is significant that the remains of Celtic Christian ritual today tends to be outdoor, as at holy wells and mountain pilgrimages. In the phrase, "In him we live and move and have our being," we have a quotation, not from the Old Testament, but from the pagan poet Epimenides, Lati 1936. The phrase carries overtones of an archaic system of philosophy and is reminiscent of the immanence, which will be discussed later in association with Celtic thought. The phrase, "for we are indeed his offspring," is taken from the poet Aratus. Whatever the original meaning may have been, it bears a remarkable resemblance to what Caesar said of the Celtic Gauls. The Gauls all assert their ascent from Dios Pater and say that it is the Druidic belief. Dios Pater was the Roman god of the dead and corresponds to the Irish god of the dead, Donn. His great sanctuary, a small rocky island off the coast of Kerry and also in County Limerick, and this was his last noble bequest to his hundreds of descendants. To me, to my house, ye shall all come after your death. The great megalithic site of Newgrange at Burnaboyne, County Meath, is thought to have been constructed around the latter part of the 4th millennium BC, She Toig, 1990, thousands of years before the Celts came to Ireland. Nevertheless, it is the Celtic gods and goddesses which are associated with Burnaboyne in Irish literature: An Dagda, Angus Og, Manan MacLear, Myrdin, Bon, Seirseog, Étain. This Celtic pantheon has obviously taken over a sacred site of the Neolithic age. From what has been said, it is clear that we are not dealing with one exclusive religious system, but rather with a series of different religions and cultures which have influenced each other. This, of course, makes the subject vastly more complex than dealing with a homogeneous system, but on the other hand is far more interesting. It shows the progression and, at the same time, the stability of the human search for the divine. The person is eager to press onwards on the path to God using new insights, and in the case of Christianity, a new revelation, but reluctant to part company with the ancient gods and the old ways. The Catholic religion has been particularly blessed in adopting generously the ancient ways, thought patterns, and customs of diverse peoples. In this way, the continuity of tradition has been preserved, linking the insights of early races with those of their more technologically advanced successors. It may well be that primal societies living close to the earth may have had a more integrated view of life than we have today. We now turn to the Celts themselves to see something of their origins, way of life, and general characteristics. What distinguished them as a race will no doubt be reflected in their distinct type of Christianity. Part 1. Who were the Celts? Chapter 1. The Celts. Very briefly, it is generally held that the Celts began as a distinct people with their own language, customs, political and social organization, and general culture about 1000 BC in the areas we now associate with Central and South Germany, the Harz Mountains, Austria, Bavaria, and Bohemia. It appears that a group from the local Indo-European population gradually began to separate itself from the main body and developed a distinct language and culture, and this group became known to Greek writers as the Celti. From an early period, the Celts were associated with the salt mine of Hallstatt near Salzburg, and as salt was an extremely valuable product in those days, the Celts of Hallstatt became immensely wealthy, and the area became a great artistic and ironworking site. The large number of graves with their grave goods testify to the importance of the area. At a later stage, Letienne in Switzerland became another great artistic center, and the delicate curvilinear type of decoration which can be seen in brooches, swords, spears, etc. in the museums appears to be influenced by the Letienne school. Cunliffe, 1992, pages 16 through 17. At any rate, during the first few centuries BC, the Celts began to expand, and with their iron weapons and the use of the horse and war chariot, set off to conquer new lands. Gaul, modern France, became their second home, and again luck favored them as regards wealth, for Gaul was Gallia Aurifera, or gold-bearing Gaul, and the gold washed down from the mountains became a source of great wealth to the Celts. Another great source of wealth was the fees charged to traders using the great rivers. One of our greatest indications of the wealth and prestige of the Celts of this period is the grave of a Celtic princess in Vic in France, Côte d'Or. She appears to have died around 480 BC at about the age of 35. She was buried with her chariot, and beside her body was an immense bronze wine crater with ornamental cups for distributing the wine. She wore a necklace of large stone and amber beads, bronze ankle rings, bracelets, and a massive torque or collar of pure gold. This is no isolated case, as similar graves have been found elsewhere. The Celts penetrated into parts of Spain, into the British Isles, into the Rhineland of Germany, and, on the other side, into North Italy, the Balkans, and finally established a colony in Galatia in Asia Minor. St. Paul's letter to the Galatians is addressed to these Celts of Turkey. Generally speaking, words such as Galatia, Galicia in Spain, and in Poland, Gaul, Gallia, Gael, Galil, indicate the presence of the Celts. For about 500 years, the Celts dominated Europe, and it is significant that a recent book on the Celts by Christian Ellure is entitled The Celts, First Masters of Europe. On archaeological evidence, the arrival of the Celts in Ireland is quite late, in a series of migrations taking place during the first few centuries BC. On the other hand, if it is accepted that a Celtic dialect was already in use among the Bronze Age inhabitants of Ireland, the date of arrival would be pushed back perhaps over 1,000 years. Was the maker of a late Bronze Age ornament a speaker of Proto-Celtic? There is yet no certainty, but several scholars favor the earlier date. At any rate, even if the earlier date is considered more acceptable, the Celts were still latecomers to the island of Ireland. The first definite traces of man in Ireland date from about 6000 BC. The first settlers would appear to have crossed over from Scotland to Northern Ireland, and then moved southwards and westwards. However, little remains from this early period, and we have to wait for another 3,000 years for the great influx of Stone Age people from Britain or from further afield. These newcomers were better equipped, with polished stone axes to hew down areas of forest and gradually turn it into fertile land for the growing of wheat and barley. Cattle, sheep, and goats grazed on the cleared areas, and no doubt the diet was supplemented by hunting, fishing, and wild berries. An excellent insight into the blending of the megalithic, Bronze Age, Celtic, and Norman into each other can be gleaned from a visit to Lough Gur in County Limerick, where much has been preserved from the remote and not so remote past. Here, extensive archaeological excavations have discovered the remains of the simple thatched houses used by Stone Age man at Lough Gur, and the information center on the site is a reconstruction of this type of dwelling. The stone circles and megalithic graves surrounding the lake indicate a preoccupation with religious ritual. One of the most impressive stone circles in Ireland is at Grange beside Lough Gur. The remains of other circles, a standing stone, a megalithic tomb, in close proximity to the enormous circle, might suggest a whole religious complex in this area. Pottery from the late Stone Age and early Bronze Age, circa 2000 to 1500 BC, was found inside the Grange Circle, again suggesting a peaceful merging of eras and possibly the amalgamation of different religious ideas. Radiocarbon dating has shown that the great megalithic site at Newgrange is somewhat older than the County Limerick site, having been constructed about 3300 BC. Again, when we consider the later Celtic mythology connecting Celtic deities such as Andagda and Angus Og with Newgrange, Bruna Burn, the impression is given of one system seeming to slip into another in quite a natural manner that seems oddly at variance with our modern tendency towards rigorous categorization. This impression is rather strengthened by the seeming ease with which Christianity took root in Ireland, giving rise to the tradition that there were no martyrs in the transition from paganism to Christianity. This rather strange impression of continuity and change, this absence of abrupt and violent transitions, must be taken into account in our later treatment of Celtic religion and ritual. It would be a mistake to make the categories too rigorous and exclusive of one another. It would seem rather that a certain fluidity of thought existed, making it possible to show more continuity and even dependence between different religious systems. The enormous expansion of the Celts from Ireland in the west to Galatia, modern Turkey in the east, in the first few centuries BC, might have seemed the ideal situation for the foundation of a great Celtic empire. Such, however, did not occur. The Celtics seem to have lacked the sense of cohesion, of common effort, and the flair for centralized government necessary for the foundation and consolidation of a great empire or commonwealth. They squandered resources through internal divisions and engaged as mercenaries in foreign armies. This inability to plan ahead ahead coldly and calculatingly, and to pursue a united campaign appears to have been a fatal defect which dogged the Celts throughout their history, and perhaps nowhere so much as in Ireland. It was a weakness which her enemies traded on to perfection. Dr. Ann Ross quotes a passage from the historian Polybius, who illustrates the impetuosity of the Celts in rushing into battle without adequate planning. Such was the end of the war against the Celts, a war which, if we look to the desperation and daring of the combatants and the numbers who took part and perished in the battles, is second to no war in history, but is quite contemptible as regards the plan of campaigns and the judgment shown in executing it. Not most steps, but every single step the Celts took being commended to them rather by the heat of passion than by cool calculation. Similarly, Strabo remarks, the whole race which is now called Gallic or Galatic is madly fond of war, high-spirited and quick to battle, but otherwise straightforward and not of evil character. And so, when they are stirred up, they assemble in their bands for a battle, quite openly and without forethought, so that they are easily handled by those who desire to outwit them. For at any time or place, and on whatever pretext you stir them up, you will have them ready to face danger. Even after 2,000 years, this record of impetuous action and distaste for planning the strategy of warfare seems not to have changed. We have a marvelous account of the Battle of Llanban near Clonmel in the Rebellion of 1798, which says in Irish what had been said in Greek nearly 2,000 years earlier. Our major did not come to us at the start of the day, and we ourselves weren't there in proper order and formation, but like a herd of cows let loose without a shepherd at the sunny side of Llanban. If this type of incompetent fumbling in practical matters were a racial characteristic, it is no wonder that a Celtic empire never emerged. As we shall see, the classical authors have no doubt about the personal bravery of the Celts, as again in the personal sphere of artistic metalwork and poetry, the precision and order is beyond question. The peculiar difficulty seems to arise when a large number of individuals have to submerge their own individuality in the pursuit of a common cause. In short, a Celtic empire in the political sense never emerged, and no great centers such as Rome or London ever developed in the Celtic area. After their sudden expansion and rise to power, the Celts suffered a rapid decline. They were subjected to pressure from all sides: Dacians in the east, Germans in the north, and Romans in the south. The lack of unity, the absence of a center of administration and lines of communication soon made themselves felt. Above all, the Celts were no match for the cohesive power and discipline of the Roman Empire. In the 1st century BC, Gaul, which might at this time be considered as the home par excellence of the Celts, had been conquered by Caesar. By the 5th century AD, the Celtic language of Gaul had practically ceased to exist, and while the Roman Empire had collapsed in its turn, it was the Roman language and culture which was to prevail throughout the coming centuries, rather than that of the Celts. In Britain, the Celts were experiencing similar reversals and were being pushed into the remoter western areas of Wales and Cornwall by the Anglo-Saxon invaders. The case of Ireland, of course, was different. The country was never invaded by the Romans and enjoyed a full measure of freedom to pursue its own cultural and political course. It is unlikely that the introduction of Christianity or the depredations of Vikings and Danes altered to any great extent the evolution of society according to a basic Celtic pattern until a new era began with the coming of the Normans in the 12th century. Even then, Gaelic ways and language continued unabated for a long time to come, until the final collapse of the Gaelic order with the disastrous Battle of Kinsale and the flight of the Earls in the 17th century. The remains of this once great civilization, which at its height could be felt as a presence in areas reaching from Ireland to Asia Minor, is now reduced to a tiny remnant in 6 areas of Western Europe: Brittany, Wales, Cornwall, Scotland, Isle of Man, Ireland. The Celtic languages still linger on, but only as a whisper. In view of the mighty power of Anglo-American culture, it is surprising that Irish and Welsh are still spoken, even in such sadly reduced circumstances. It is surely a sign of their tenacity and vigor in the face of such appalling odds. While death beckons menacingly at the once great civilization, a lingering breath still remains, which perhaps could be the breath of life, for the jaded victims of the consumer society. For myth is the great strength of the Celts, and myth is associated with the hidden powers of renewal. Chapter 2. Lifestyle and Customs. A great deal of our information on the continental Celts is derived from Posidonius, 135 to 51 BC. His works have been lost, but luckily for us, much of what he wrote about the Celts was copied by others close to the beginning of the Christian era. Among those writers, Caesar holds an important place. In his account of the Gallic War, in which he defeated the Celts of Gaul, his description of the people must have been influenced by personal experience and political motivation, as well as by the information supplied by Posidonius. The other three outstanding writers on the Celts from this early period, and also dependent on Posidonius, are Athenaeus, Diodorus Siculus, and Strabo, all writing in Greek. Previous to these, however, was the historian Polybius, whose notes on the Celts are neatly summarized by Professor Tierney. Lastly, we come to Polybius, the most voluminous author so far on the Celts. The mass of his material, as is natural, concerns history and geography, but a few passages can be found of ethnographical interest. In a short passage on Celtic living conditions in Cisalpine Gaul, he mentions such points as their beds of straw, their meat-eating, their pursuit of war and agriculture, and simplicity of life, and finally their institution of clientship, all of which points we shall meet again. In connection with the Battle of Telamon, 225 BC, we hear of the Celtic breeches and cloaks, their necklaces and bracelets, of their vanity and bravado in fighting naked, their head-hunting, their use of trumpets, their reckless courage and self-sacrifice in battle, and their mass suicide on defeat. Later on, we hear of the golden sandals of a goddess, Athena, clearly a Celtic war goddess, and of the fact that the Gauls are most fearful only in their first spirited attack. A most interesting passage describes a series of duels instituted by Hannibal among Celtic prisoners on his arrival in Italy. The prize was royal panoply, a horse and cloak. His account of the universal desire to fight and the universal congratulation of the vanquished dead, no less than the victor, throws a brilliant light on Celtic psychology. Appearance. Diodorus Siculus gives an excellent account of the appearance of the Celts and seems much impressed by the long hair and the treatment of it. It is likely, however, that the blonde or reddish hair referred to was not universal, and among such a far-flung and diverse society there must have been many stocky dark people. The Gauls are tall in stature, and their flesh is very moist and white, while their hair is not only naturally blonde, but they also use artificial means to increase this natural quality of color, for they continually wash their hair with lime wash and draw it back from the forehead to the crown and to the nape of the neck, with the result that their appearance resembles that of satyrs or of pans, for the hair is so thickened by this treatment that it differs in no way from a horse's mane. Some shave off the beard, while others cultivate a short beard. The nobles shave the cheeks, but let the mustache grow freely. Diodorus Siculus again describes the colorful Celtic dress. The chief articles of a man's dress seem to have been a trousers, baggy or tight, a thigh-length tunic, and over this, the great brat, or cloak fastened by a large brooch. The trousers seem to have gone to the Celts from the horse-riding Scythians with whom they had been in contact, and from whom they no doubt learned their ability with horses. They wear a striking kind of clothing, tunics dyed and stained in various colors, and trousers, which they call by the name of brachai, and they wear striped cloaks, fastened with buckles, thick in winter and light in summer, picked out with a variegated small check pattern. Tierney, 1960, pages 250 through 251. The same author gives an interesting account of the wealth of the Celts of Gaul derived from unmined gold. Archaeological finds, such as the grave of the Celtic princess at Vie, France, with her massive torque of pure gold, confirm his remarks. The gold could be used as grave goods for the dead, for ornaments for the living, and for offerings to the divinities. On the whole, silver is not found throughout Gaul, but there is a great deal of gold which nature yields to the inhabitants without the difficulties of mining. For the rivers, as they course through their winding bends and dash against the banks of the mountains, which lie alongside, break off large masses from them, and become filled with gold dust. Those who are engaged in the business gather this together and grind or pound the lumps which hold the dust, and by repeated washings they rid it of the earthly element and hand it over to the furnaces for smelting. In this way they accumulate large quantities of gold and make use of it for personal adornment. Not only the women but also the men, for they wear bracelets on wrists and arms, and round their necks thick rings of solid gold, and they wear also fine finger rings and even golden tunics. The Celts of the hinterland have a strange and peculiar custom in connection with the sanctuaries of the gods, for in the temples and sanctuaries, which are dedicated throughout the country, a large amount of gold is openly placed as a dedication to the gods, and for the native inhabitants none touch it because of religious veneration, although the Celts are unusually fond of money. Food and drink. Another Greek writer, Athenaeus, discusses the food and drink of the Celts. The Celts sit on dried grass and have their meals served up on wooden tables raised above the earth. Their food consists of a small number of loaves of bread together with a large amount of meat, either boiled or roasted on charcoal or on spits. They partake of this in a clearly but leonine fashion, raising up whole limbs in both hands and biting off the meat, while any part which is hard to tear off they cut through with a small dagger, which hangs attached to their sword sheath in its own scabbard. Those who live beside the rivers or near the Mediterranean or Atlantic eat fish in addition, baked fish, that is, with the addition of salt, vinegar, and cumin. They also use cumin in their drinks. They do not use olive oil because of its scarcity, and because of its unfamiliarity it appears unpleasant to them. When a large number dine together, they sit around in a circle with the most influential man in the center. Like the leader of the chorus, whether he surpassed the others in warlike skill or nobility of family or wealth, beside him sits the host, and next on either side the others in order of distinction. Their shieldsmen stand behind them, while their spearsmen are seated in a circle on the opposite side and feast in common like their lords. The servers bear around the drink in terracotta or silver jars like spouted cups. The trenchers on which they serve the food are also of these materials, while with others they are made of bronze or are woven on wooden baskets. The drink of the wealthy classes is wine imported from Italy or from the territory of Marseille. This is unadulterated, but sometimes a little water is added. The lower classes drink wheaten beer prepared with honey, but most people drink it plain. It is called korma. They use a common cup, drinking a little at a time, not more than a mouthful, but they do it rather frequently. The slave serves the cup towards the right, not towards the left. That is the method of service. In the same way they do reverence to the gods, turning towards the right. And in former times, when the hindquarters were served up, the bravest hero took the thigh piece, and if another man claimed it, they stood up and fought in single combat to the death. The scene which he describes is obviously a great communal feast given by a king or great lord, such as we meet so frequently in ancient Irish stories, such as Silmuki Miacdato and Fledbricren. What is remarkable in the south is the hierarchical layout of the assembly, with each person occupying his proper place according to his rank and distinction. The Curamir, or hero's portion, forms part of the account, and we have several descriptions of this custom at feasts in Irish literature. The best warrior present was allowed to cut the meat. He naturally gave the largest portions to himself and his friends, leaving little for the lesser folk. Often a fight started over this, and even before the division took place, who was to decide who was the best warrior? The hilarious contention of the heroes for the privilege of cutting up the pig in the Talamak Datog pig ends in a riot, The two accounts show the unity of custom prevailing among the continental and insular Celts. Athenaeus makes a most interesting remark when he says that the server takes the vessel of korma, Irish corm ale, around the circle of seated participants right-hand-wise, clockwise, and he says further that the same method is followed in religious ritual. In the same way they do reverence to the gods, turning towards the right. This is obviously the Yampu Desal of the holy wells and pilgrimage sites of Ireland, in which the pilgrims go around the well or other sacred object, one after the other in single file, being careful to keep the well at their right-hand side, following the course of the sun. This ancient ritual is something we will examine in greater detail later, but what a supremely moving experience it is in the 20th century to see people encircling the holy wells, turning to the right, as Athenaeus had said 2,000 years earlier. Domestic life. Further information on the domestic arrangements of the Gaulish Celts is given by Strabo, and undoubtedly much of it would also apply to the Celts of Ireland. I have already described the members of the Helvetii and of the Averni and their allies, and all this shows the great size of the population, and moreover, a point which I have already mentioned, the excellence of their women in bearing and rearing children. They wear the sagus, let their hair grow long, and wear baggy trousers. Instead of the ordinary tunics, they wear divided tunics with sleeves reaching down as far as the private parts and the buttocks. Their wool is rough and thin at the ends, and from it they weave the thick sagi, which they call lenae. Even to the present day, most people sleep on the ground and dine seated on the litter of straw. They have large quantities of food together with milk and all kinds of meat, especially fresh and salt pork. Their pigs are allowed to run wild and are noted for their height and pugnacity and swiftness. It is dangerous for a stranger to approach them, and also for a wolf. Their houses are large and circular, built of planks and wickerwork, the roof being a dome of heavy thatch. They have such enormous flocks of sheep and herds of swine that they afford a plenteous supply of sagi and of milk and of salt meat, not only to Rome, but to most parts of Italy. Most of their governments used to be aristocratic, and in ancient times they used to elect one leader annually, and in the same way one man was declared general by the people to lead in war. But now, for the most part, they are subject to the commands of Rome. Diodorus Siculus remarks on the cold climate of Gaul with its terrible storms, which are sufficiently strong to tear the clothes off their wearers. He connects the harshness of the climate with the Celtic fondness for drink. And since the quantities of the climate are spoiled by the excessive cold, the land bears neither wine nor oil, and therefore the Gauls, being deprived of these fruits, concoct a drink out of barley called zithos, beer, and they wash honeycombs and use the washings as a drink. They are exceedingly fond of wine, and sate themselves with the unmixed wine imported by merchants. Their desire makes them drink it greedily, and when they become drunk they fall into a stupor, or into a maniacal disposition, and therefore many Italian merchants, with their usual love of lucre, look on the Gallic love of wine as their treasure trove. They transport the wine by boat on the navigable rivers and by wagon through the plains, and receive in return for it an incredibly large price. For one jar of wine they receive in return a slave, a servant in exchange for the drink. The Celts in battle. Diodorus Siculus gives a lucid and most comprehensive account of several important factors in Celtic life: the belief in the immortality of the soul, with its effects on the conduct of funerals, the elaborate battle tactics, the custom of single combat, well known in Ireland from stories such as Tainbo Cullin and Forbes Drama Damgir. By allowing only chosen warriors to fight and die, the vast casualties of ordinary warfare were avoided. There was the noisy boasting of deeds of valor with the intention of intimidating the opponent, and the custom of the severed head, again well known from the Tain in the incident in which Cuchulainn deals with Ferchulónsec and his 12 companions. Ferchu took counsel with his men. "What better plan could we carry out," said he, "than go and attack yonder man who is checking and holding back the 4 great provinces of Ireland, and to bring back with us his head in triumph to Ailill and Maeve. Though we have done many wrongs and injuries to Ailill and Maeve, we shall obtain peace thereby, if that man fall by us." That is the plan they decided on, and they came forward to the place where Cuchulainn was, and when they came, they did not grant him fair play or single combat, but all 12 of them attacked him straightway. However, Cuchulainn fell upon them, and forthwith struck off their 12 heads, and he planted 12 stones for them in the ground, and put a head of each one on them on its stone, and also put Fercu Loinsec's head on its stone, so that the spot where Fercu Loinsec left his head is called Chinit Ferchon, that is, Chinit Ferchon, the head place of Fercu. The severed head set up in front homes and temples is a custom which seems to have some very profound meaning not fully understood. For the moment it is sufficient to recall that some of our ancient churches, notably Clonfert Cathedral, County Galway, Desartodé, County Clare, and several others, display the severed head at the doorway. Theodorus Siculus gives a very early and clear account of these matters. They also invite strangers to their banquets, and only after the meal do they ask who they are and of what they stand in need. At dinner they are wont to be moved by chance remarks to wordy disputes, and after a challenge to fight in single combat, regarding their lives as naught, for the belief of Pythagoras is strong among them, that the souls of men are immortal, and that after a definite number of years they live a second life when the soul passes into another body. This is the reason given by some people at the burial of the dead, cast upon the pyre letters written to their dead relatives, thinking that the dead will be able to read them. For their journeys and in battle they use 2-horse chariots, the chariot carrying both charioteer and chieftain. When they meet with cavalry in the battle, they cast their javelins at the enemy, and then, descending from the chariot, join battle with their swords. Some of them so far despise death that they descend to do battle, unclothed except for a girdle. They bring into battle as their attendants free men chosen from among the poorer classes, whom they use as charioteers and shield-bearers in battle. When the armies are drawn up in battle array, they are wont to advance before the battle line and to challenge the bravest of their opponents to single combat, at the same time brandishing before them their arms, so as to terrify their foe. And when someone accepts their challenge to battle, they loudly recite the deeds of valor of their ancestors and proclaim their own valorous quality, at the same time abusing and making little of their opponent, and generally attempting to rob him beforehand of his fighting spirit. They cut off the heads of enemies slain in battle and attach them to the necks of their horses. The blood-stained spoils they hand over to their attendants and carry off as booty, while striking up a paean and singing a song of victory, and they nail up these first fruits upon their houses, just as do those who lay low wild animals in certain kinds of hunting. They embalm in cedar oil the heads of the most distinguished enemies, and preserve them carefully in a chest, and display them with pride to strangers, saying that for this head one of their ancestors, or his father, or the man himself, refused the offer of a large sum of money. They say that some of them boast that they refuse the weight of the head in gold. The same story is told of the Celts by Strabo in a different way. To the frankness and high-spiritedness of their temperament must be added the traits of childish boastfulness and love of decoration. They wear ornaments of gold, torques on their necks, and bracelets on their arms and wrists, while people of high rank wear dyed garments besprinkled with gold. It is this vanity which makes them unbearable in victory, and so completely downcast in defeat. In addition to their witlessness, they possess a trait of barbarous savagery which is especially peculiar to the northern peoples. For when they are leaving the battlefield, they fasten to the necks of their horses the heads of their enemies, and on arriving home they nail up this spectacle at the entrances to their houses. Posidonius says that he saw this sight in many places, and was at first disgusted by it, but afterwards, becoming used to it, could bear it with equanimity. But they embalmed the heads of distinguished enemies with cedar oil, and used to make a display of them to strangers, and were unwilling to let them be redeemed even for their weight in gold. two marvelous statues from Pergamum in Asia Minor, Turkey, and dating from the 3rd century BC, show the heroic Celts in battle. The first statue shows a defeated Celt looking over his shoulder at his pursuers. He is naked with carefully treated hair. Rather than be subjected to slavery, he has killed his wife and supports her with his left hand as he sinks to the ground. With his right hand he plunges his sword into his own breast. The second statue, often called the Dying Gaul, shows a naked warrior with treated hair and mustache and a rich torque around his neck. Beside him is his sword and trumpet. Even though some of the Celts went into battle naked, Diodorus Siculus gives a description of the Celtic protective equipment. Their armor includes man-sized shields, decorated in individual fashion. Some of these have projecting bronze animals of fine workmanship, which serve for defense as well as decoration. On their heads they wear bronze helmets, which possess large projecting figures, lending the appearance of enormous stature to the wearer. In some cases, horns form one piece with the helmet, while in other cases it is relief figures of the foreparts of birds or quadrupeds. Their trumpets again are of peculiar barbaric kind. They blow into them and produce a harsh sound, which suits the tumult of war. Some have iron breastplates of chainmail, while others fight naked, and for them the breastplate given by nature suffices. Instead of the short sword, they carry long swords held by iron or bronze chains and hanging along their right flank. Chapter 3. Political Organization. As regards the type of political organization and territorial divisions, we are better informed in the case of Ireland than of the continent. The political and administrative unit, in theory at least, was the Tua. This was a small kingdom presided over by a petty king. In theory, the Tua was an independent political unit, but in practice it happened frequently that a number were joined together under one king, who succeeded in acquiring neighboring territory by right of conquest. As political and military fortunes changed, territorial divisions changed with them, but in general the pattern emerges of a small compact territorial unit organized on the lines resembling the feudal system. The king, Re Tua, was surrounded by a number of Flada nobles. They received lands and cattle from him and were required to pay him taxes. They in turn hired out land and cattle to Bauri, farmers and cultivators, who paid taxes to the Flata. It was not, however, a completely one-way arrangement. The boyar, for instance, as a client, Kili, of his lord, Tierna Flay, was bound by Brehon law to pay his taxes, usually in kind, so much corn, pigs, cattle, beer, etc. each year, and also perhaps such things as swords, brooches, cloaks, drinking horns, and also perhaps provide some entertainment and military service. But the Keli, or client, had equally clear rights in Brehon law. He was Faucomir Anflata, under the protection of the Tausig, or lord, who was bound to protect him if his rights were endangered by his neighbors or a lord of some nearby territory. The king to the system was clientship, Chilsin, and an aristocrat's position in society was judged by the number of his clients. Just as in more recent times, the wealth and prestige of a farmer was often calculated by the number of cows he owned. The Flay's prestige was judged by the number of clients depending on him. In Ireland, the role of the king must not be seen in terms of a great and powerful autocrat. The enormous body of Brehon law provided a fixed system of legislation for the government of society, and the king's powers were chiefly used in negotiating treaties with other kings and business involving relations with another Tua. In times of peace, at any rate, the king's duties may not have been overburdensome. Cuncor MacNisa of Ulster is described as spending his day in the following manner: 1/3 spent in watching the youths play hurley on the field before the Dun fort, 1/3 playing fischl, a board game perhaps somewhat like chess, and the third part drinking korma beer and listening to storytelling until he fell asleep. Quite a pleasant daily program. The Anak, one of the national institutions which seems to have embraced both political and literacy elements, was the Anak, modern Anak. This was much more than a fair or marker in the modern sense, as is clear from an extant account of Anakarman, On the calends of August without fail, they repaired thither every 3rd year. There aloud with boldness they proclaimed the rights of every law and the restraints. Leaving aside the controversial question of the location of Enoch Carman, near Wexford in Loch Garman, or with much greater probability near Knockholland, once a royal seat of the King of Leinster in the Curragh of Kildare, the verses indicate the wide variety of activities engaged in during the week of Anach lasted. The laws were proclaimed, the presumably new regulations and decisions affecting the local population promulgated. It must have been a very effective instrument of government in the hands of an effective ruler, but it was also a great social and cultural occasion. Musicians, poets, storytellers of all kinds gathered to entertain the crowds, and the traditional list of thematic stories were recited. Stories of cattle raids, courtships, elopements, destructions, and so forth. Horse racing was a notable part of the celebrations, 7 races per day according to the prose account. The other great provincial fairs brought together the tribes of the province to the neighborhood of the chief stronghold of the king, and must have followed the same general pattern of that of Carman. These were Anachtelten in the kingdom of Winel, Anach Enma in the kingdom of Ulaid, Anach Tais Nenag in Mummo, depending on Cashel, and Anach Crochan in Connacht. At last, in some cases, fairs were held near the sites of ancient burial grounds. This is made clear in the case of Anach Carman. 7 mounds without touching each other, where the dead have oft been lamented. 7 plains sacred without a house, for the funeral games of Carman. The same connection between Anach and burial mound is found in the case of Anachtelten and Cruchan, and indeed, it may well have been a universal feature originating in the funeral games of the ancestors. While the local Anach must have been a much more modest affair, it no doubt played a highly important part in the political, social, and cultural life of the local community. The Anach combined in one celebration many aspects of the life of the community. The political and legal aspect of it might be compared to the promulgation of the law in Manx Gaelic and English from Tynwald Hill in present-day practice on the Isle of Man. Something of the cultural aspect of the great Anach can be seen in the Iarchtas in Ireland, and especially in the National Eisteddfod of Wales. A modern race meeting, agricultural show, and cattle mart would embrace other aspects of it. It can be readily understood why the assembly of Carman took 2 years to prepare. It was a highly sophisticated and complex assembly which brought together in microcosmic form the interwoven strands of Gaelic society. Class in Celtic Ireland. As we have seen in Celtic Ireland before the coming of the Normans, and indeed for a long time after in some areas, the political unit was the Tua, of which there may have been about 100. The number tended to vary with conquests and amalgamations by petty kings. Society was divided into basically 3 classes: Ray, Flatha, and Ausdana, king, aristocracy, large landowners, and the learned class, druids, fili, bards, laukra, warriors, Bowery, farmers. This system is in accordance with the Indo-European system and is quite reasonable in terms of the ordering of society. For any type of state, no matter how small it may be, some kind of governing body is required. Then some kind of army is necessary to defend the territory, and finally farmers are required to provide food for the population. A learned class, like the Brahmins in the Indian tradition, is proficient in all that pertains to legislature, religious matters, territorial divisions, medicine, genealogies, and general culture. Craftsmen, and especially the Gaba or blacksmith, had a recognized and valued position in society, and even among the Chuadedanan, the Celtic deities, the blacksmith god Goibnu is prominent. It is he who forges the spears for the Chuadedanan army in their struggle against the dark gods, the Fomre, in Cathme Terig. Almost to our own day, a certain mystique enveloped the Gaba. He knew the mystery of ironwork, of how to mold the molten mass of metal brought to its new state over intense fire and plunged into water to retain its new form. He was the craftsman who held the secrets of transmutation. The role of the Lakra As regards the Laucra, or Equites Knights, as Caesar called them before his own arrival to conquer Gaul, it used to happen nearly every year that they either attacked another tribe or warded off the attacks of another tribe. This idea of annual warfare may be put in conjunction with the passage which follows in De Bello Gallico, where Caesar gives a description of the notorious Wicker Man sacrifice. The whole Gallic people is exceedingly given to religious superstition. Therefore, those who are suffering from serious illness or are in the midst of the dangers of battle either put to death human beings as sacrificial victims or take a vow to do so. And the Druids take part in these sacrifices, for they believe that unless one human life is given in exchange for another human life, the power of the almighty gods cannot be appeased. Sacrifices of this kind are also traditionally offered for the needs of the state. Some tribes build enormous images with limbs of interwoven branches, which they then fill with live men. The images are set alight, and the men die in a sea of flame. They believe that the immortal gods delight more in the slaughter of those taken in theft or brigandage or some crime, but when the supply of that kind runs short, they descend even to the sacrifice of the innocent. Diodorus Siculus also discusses this type of human sacrifice in which the victims were burned. They keep evildoers in custody for 5 years and then impale them in honor of their gods. They construct enormous pyres and then devote them together with many other first fruits. They also use prisoners of war as sacrificial victims in paying honor to their gods. Putting together Caesar's account of the annual war and Diodorus Siculus's account of using prisoners of war as sacrificial victims, we might well wonder if one of the purposes of war among the Celts was to secure victims to be sacrificed for the welfare of the state and society. In other words, was war among the Celts considered to be a religious act carried out by the Laucra on an annual basis for the purpose of obtaining suitable material to be sacrificed to the gods, who in return would bring fertility to the land and stability to the state? The accounts of the sacrificial rituals of the Celts appear to bear some resemblance to those of the Aztecs. They reasoned that for man to survive, the gods who permit his existence must also live and wax strong. These gods, however, receive their best nutriment from the most precious of offerings, the hearts of men. Thus a vicious circle became established which led to sacrifice on an increasing scale. The gods manifested their favor and their strength to the Aztecs by letting them prosper, but the Aztecs, on their part, had to sacrifice hearts to the gods to maintain their goodwill. War captives were the most esteemed offering. The Aztec victim was held down, an incision was made in his chest with a stone knife, and the still beating heart plucked out and offered to the god. War among the Aztecs then could be regarded as in the light of a cosmic sacrifice. By killing or being killed, one paid one's debt to nature to whom one owed one's life. A similar interpretation is given by Sylvie Muller in her research on the Wren ritual in Ireland. On St. Stephen's Day, the period of the winter solstice, the wren is caught and killed and taken from house to house by a company of masked figures, and Drelin, the wren boys. The wren stands for man, and the wren has to die to pay back its debt to nature. Death is the price he had to pay for the gift of life. Valiant sums up neatly the concept of human sacrifice. Thus, instances of human sacrifices keep cropping up in the world's religious systems, and we preserve in our own culture the concept of martyrdom, achieved by voluntary or involuntary means, as an act of virtue. The very beautiful example of the Savior transmutes to the highest spiritual plane this idea of sacrifice for the good of humanity. It may be then that among the Celts, war had a religious function in providing materials for sacrifice, and so maintaining the order of the universe, the rising of the sun and moon, the cyclic succession of the seasons, the appropriate measure of sunshine and rain to produce abundant harvests. If so, the Laucra played a vital part in society as entrusted with the functioning of the cosmos. All this is indicative of the integral part which the individual played in the universe, which was kept in motion by his contribution to it, along and in harmony with the other members of society. There is another unexpected element to be seen in the Loch. He often needs the support of a Springer or insider to urge him on in the thick of the fight, to upbraid him or praise him as the case may be. The hero often needs the support of others when he is in danger of losing heart. We find an excellent example of this in Tainbo Cullen. Cuchulainn is watching Ferdain, his formidable opponent, practicing his marvelous feats, and he tells his charioteer Log that today all these feats of skill will be employed against himself with deadly effect. When Cuchulainn tells Log what to do, "You must incite me and revile me and speak evil of me, so that my ire and anger shall rise the higher thereby. But if it be I who inflict defeat, you must exhort me and praise me, and speak well of me, that thereby my courage rise higher." "It shall be done indeed, little Cu," said Lug. The opportunity arrives soon enough, for Cuchulainn is being buffeted unmercifully by Ferdain. Lug spouts out, "Alas, your opponent has chastised you as a fond mother chastises her child. He has belabored you as flax is beaten in a pond. He has pierced you as a tool pierces an oak. He has attacked you as a hawk attacks little birds, so that never again will you have a claim or right or title to valor or feats of arms, you distorted little sprite." Cuchulainn is incensed by these insults. His Raestrat, or battle distortions, transform him into a deadly monster, and he makes short work of Ferdain. Similarly, in the story Forbestroma Damgir, the siege of Knocklong, Caird Leifchart acts as Springer or insider to Culpa, the Leinster hero, as he fights against Shenmore Munster. It does seem that the great fighter needs to some extent the support of his friends acting in praise or derision, in much the same way as sports people and show people are dependent to a degree on their followers. But perhaps this concept was applied also to the great hero, God, who has to defend and keep intact the order of creation, the cosmos, against the constant attacks of the forces of disintegration and chaos. While God, of course, has supreme power, it does seem that he expects the support of his followers in prayer and supplication in his never-ending conflict of cosmos and chaos. There is the incident of Israel's battle with her foes to illustrate the point. Israel is dependent on God's power to give them victory, and he is perfectly capable of doing so on his own. But while the battle rages, Moses keeps his arms raised in prayer, and while he holds them thus in the ancient orante position, still used by the priest during the Eucharistic prayer of the Mass, all goes well with the Israelites, but it is difficult to sustain this uncomfortable gesture for very long, and Moses' arms began to grow tired and droop. Each time this happened, the Israelites suffered a setback. Then Moses had his arms held up by helpers at each side so that Israel recovered and won the battle. Exodus 17. It does seem that here we have a basis for the continuous prayer and ascetic practices of the Celtic Christian traditions. Just as in many ancient religious systems, the gods had to be kept well fed with sacrifices so that they would have the energy to keep the ordered cycles of the cosmos intact and stave off the forces of disorder and disintegration. So it would seem that God in the Christian system demands continual sacrifice in prayer and devotion. In other words, God is associating us with his own function of keeping the universe in existence, preserving it from dissolution into chaos. We have a marvelous example of this in Tirim na Éireann, a 17th century political poem in which the poet Sean O'Duinn recounts the terrible disasters which have occurred and left the country in a state of misery and disintegration. While all this may have been a punishment for sin, at the same time there is a certain lack of conviction that this is entirely the case, and the poet hurls a few insults at God for allowing this terrible catastrophe. God's seeming indifference and inactivity hardly conforms to the promises to St. Patrick. "O God, you formed the moon and the stars. You made heaven and earth and sky. You were and you are and you will be without weariness. You are one God and not three gods. Are you deaf or where are you looking? Isn't it you that knocked down the giants with a wing? Isn't it enough for you the time you have been listening? Our religion disappeared, only a spark of it remains. Is that what you promised to St. Patrick on Mount Hermon before he came to Ireland, or on the Reek, Croagh Patrick, after fasting? Pray, and I pray myself to God of the gods, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, to forgive all our sins, and to restore their religion and their rights to the Irish. The role of the Irish king. The three major orders of society, then, among the Celts, were closely allied to the Indo-European system. This tripartite division of ruling and learned class, warriors and farmers, may be compared to the divisions of the human body, the head representing the kingship, the breast and arms representing the warrior class, and the part of the body from the waist down representing the boari, the class concerned with the reproduction. The very same by which a special type of defensive prayer is called in the Irish tradition the Luriac, is a Gaelicization of the Latin lorica, the warrior's metal breastplate. It is difficult to know if the severed head had some connection with kingship, or the silnagig with the boari. At any rate, it is the special position of the king in Irish tradition which introduces us to the mystical quality of the land. Despite the fact of having 100 or more kings reigning at the same time, we have no native word for coronation. The phrase used to describe the coronation or inauguration of a king throughout the centuries was banisre, the wedding of the king, or the king's woman sleeping. This was the sacral kingship in which the king was symbolically married to the goddess of the land. The purpose of the marriage was to produce a child, and the child, of course, was the harvest, the ithagus blight of ancient Irish tradition, the corn and the milk. The wedding ritual of the banisre evidently comprised two main elements, a libation offered by the bride to her partner and the coition. The sovereignty of Ireland appears to Conn of the 100 Battles seated on a crystal throne and with a vat of red liquor beside her, from which she serves him and his successor with a drink in a golden goblet, and the same essential function is implied in the name of the goddess Maeve, the intoxicating one. Perhaps a pun was employed in the ritual. The woman representing the goddess of the land gave the goblet of liquor, ale or wine, or mead, or water to the candidate for kingship. The word for liquor is leith, and the word for kingdom is flaith, so that when the goddess gave the king the leith, she gave him the flaith, and the flaith was herself. She was the land of Ireland. In the marvelous story, Echramach Echach Moimedrin, the 5 sons of Echad Mugmedon are very thirsty after a deer hunt. One after another goes to a well which is guarded by a silly or dreadful-looking hag who refuses to give any water until the man kisses her. Each refuses until the last, Neil, kisses her without hesitation, and immediately she is transformed into the most beautiful woman in the world. She declares, Mian Phleas, I am the sovereignty, and she gives him the water. He becomes the great king, Neil Noigelach, the progenitor of the O'Neills, only the suitable candidate for kingship, and the faith to see behind the disguise, and the goddess herself, having met her rightful spouse, is transformed from hag to young woman, from winter to summer, from barrenness to fertility. Here then is the mystique of ancient government in Ireland, in which a human, mortal king representing the human community is married to a divine woman to guarantee the fertility of the land. Perhaps this strange mystical quality is behind Maeve's boasting of having many lovers, each man in another man's shadow. The kings to whom Maeve was symbolically married in the Banisre, or Hierosgamos as it was called in Greece, came and went, while she, as the immortal goddess, remained forever. In a remarkable study of early Celtic traditions, Professor Wagner traces links between the Banisre and the ancient customs of Mesopotamia. The festival of the Hierosgamos, Banisre, between the earth goddess Inanna and the king, marked the beginning of the new year. Beltane, May Day, is the equivalent in Ireland, the beginning of the year of growth, marked by fertility rites even to fairly recent times. What is more remarkable is the reference to the giving of the liquor to the king by the goddess, a liqueur priestess, being thought as representative of Baba, the earth goddess, while the king himself appears as Tammuz, or related male deity. The Ben Israel tradition and the cult of the bull, Tain Bo Kulen, may both have made their way to the Celtic regions at a very early period indeed, via Massilia or through Asia Minor and Thrace. Ancient Mesopotamian belief, shaped in the 3rd millennium, were carried deep into the 1st millennium BC. This is the same Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, whose people contributed so much to biblical Israel. The Celts in the Bible were drawing from the same source. Very high standards of integrity were expected from the Irish king. The firflada, or honesty, justice, fairness of the king, was of paramount importance to his reign. If he were a good king, ruling his people with justice and integrity, the goddess would smile on him, and there would be peace and prosperity on the land. He had also to be fiel, or generous, lavish and entertaining, and giving presents. By these qualities he maintained cosmic order. If these qualities are not found in the king, his reign will collapse and his kingdom will become a wasteland. The tragic results of a mistake in administering justice is dramatically portrayed in the story of Conor Mór, Togelbrun da Derga. The 10-year reign of the Fir Bolg king, Eachag Mac Éirg, is described in glowing terms in Leber Gabala Éireann. There was no wedding in that time, but only dew. There was not a year without harvest. By him was falsehood expelled from Ireland. By him was the law of justice established first in Ireland. The passage is strangely reminiscent of Christ's kingship in the preface for the Feast of Christ the King. A kingdom of truth and life, a kingdom of holiness and grace, a kingdom of justice, love, and peace. Chapter 4. The Cult of the Ancestors, Then and Since. The Enoch, the reunion of the tribe, at a sacred place containing the graves of the ancestors, may well have been full of significance. Here the clan, in its periodical assembly, returned to the source of its existence and prosperity. The megalithic tomb is often perched on the side of a hill as if power flowed from it down to the agricultural plain and dwelling houses below. The renowned Egyptologist R.T. Rundle Clark describes the attitude of ancient peoples to the ancestors. The early agricultural peoples combined fertility rites with the cult of the dead. They were in fact two aspects of one religion, expressions of the hopes and anxieties of the community. The world seemed full of power. Everywhere would be found signs of the life force manifest in all living creatures, both animal and vegetable, in the heavens, in the waters, and in the mysterious events of disease, death, and decay. These forces could be temporarily localized in some person or place, but ancient men were not sufficiently self-conscious to think of them as residing in individuals as such. The community was not merely composed of the living, but of the ancestors as well. Life on earth was a temporary exile from the true, undifferentiated group life somewhere beyond. The ancestors, the custodians of the source of life, were the reservoir of power and the vitality, the source whence flowed all the forces of vigor, sustenance, and growth. Hence they were not only departed souls, but still active, the keepers of life and fortune. Whatever happened, whether for good or evil, ultimately derived from them. The sprouting of the corn, the increase of the herds, potency in men, success in hunting or war, were all manifestation of their power and approval. Hence the place where the ancestors dwelt was the most holy spot in the world. From it flowed the well-being of the group. Without the tomb or the cemetery, life on earth would be miserable, perhaps impossible. The ancestors were not particularized. They were a collective concept without individual names. The cult of the ancestors among African peoples has been taken into account in the liturgy of the Mass in the Zaire Rite. Brothers and sisters, we who are living on earth are not the only followers of Christ. Many have already left this world and are now with God, but together with them we make up one great family. Let us join ourselves to them, and especially to the saints, so that this sacrifice may gather us all together into one body. And you, our ancestors, be with us. You who have served God with a good conscience, be with us. Here is our prayer. Thurian and Wainwright, 1983, page 205. The inclusion of a Christianized form of intercession in this modern adaptation of the Ordo Missae to suit African conditions has seemed to some to be an innovation, But is it really so? In the first Eucharistic prayer, we have the text, "For ourselves too, we ask some share in the fellowship of your apostles and martyrs, with John the Baptist, Stephen, Matthias, Barnabas, Ignatius, Alexander, Marcellinus, Peter, Felicity, Perpetua, Agatha, Lucy, Agnes, Cecilia, Anastasia, and all the saints." Here the faithful followers of Christ who have died and the saints in heaven are the ancestors, like Abraham, our father in faith, as the Roman canon has it. The obvious place to look for some Christian equivalents or adaptations of the prehistoric cult of the ancestors is, of course, the Feast of All Saints, the 1st of November. This feast, as we shall see later, seems to owe much to the great Celtic feast of Samhain, in which the barriers between the divine world of the Tuatha Dé Danann and the human population were broken down with the consequent intermingling of the two races. But the distinction between the dead, the ancestors, and the Tuatha Dé Danann, or goddesses and gods of Ireland, is a fine one, as indeed is hinted in the Feast of All Souls on the 2nd of November, for purgatory in the Catholic tradition is another department of the other world, like hell and heaven. In the Magnificat antiphon for All Saints, Tridentine breviary, the angels and saints are bound together in one mighty concourse of supernatural beings, making intercession for us. O you angels and archangels, thrones and dominations, principalities and powers, virtues of heaven, cherubim and seraphim, these are the 9 choirs of angels, the natural inhabitants of heaven who surround the throne of God, as described in the reading for the Mass. And now comes a list of the various categories of saints who have joined them in the other world. O you patriarchs and prophets, holy doctors of the law, apostles, all martyrs of Christ, holy confessors, virgins of the Lord, hermits, and all saints, intercede for us. God is the ultimate power, but nevertheless the saints around this throne are powerful intermediaries. Another point regarding the cult of the ancestors in relation to the liturgy is the little-known rite for the consecration of a church. In the old form of the ritual in the Pontificale Romanum, the relics of the saints were kept in a building apart from the church to be consecrated. On the night before the consecration took place, a vigil was held in honor of the saints. Next day, when the sepulchre, or a little cavity in the altar of the new church, was ready, the relics were brought from their place to the new altar and buried in the sepulchre. A solemn procession was organized, and the relics, enclosed in an ornamental bier, were carried on the shoulders of 4 priests in a circular tour of the new church on the outside, followed by the bishop and the faithful, who sang Kyrie eleison over and over again. In the first part of the translation of the relics from the building to the church, the following antiphon was sung. Surgite sancti Dei, de mansionibus vestris, locia sanctificate, plebem benedicite, et nos homines peccatores in pace custodite. Arise, O saints of God, from your dwelling place. Bless these places, bless the population, and preserve us sinners in peace. Here again the close relationship between the blessed dead and the living faithful is expressed. It is they who will bring prosperity and peace to the locality, as presumably the ancestors in the megalithic tomb were considered as the benefactors of the local community. When the bishop had inserted the relics in the altar and closed up the cavity, the following antiphon was sung. Subaltari Dei, sedis accepitis sancti Dei, intercedite pro nobis ad Dominum Iesum Christum. O saints of God, you have accepted a dwelling place under the altar of God. Intercede for us with our Lord Jesus Christ. Then is added, Corpora sanctorum in pace sepulta sunt, et vivent nomina eorum in aeternum. The bodies of the saints are buried in peace, and their memory will last forever. In the early church, the custom began of building churches on the burial sites of the martyrs. Then, as Christianity spread to areas where there were no martyrs, it became customary to collect pieces of the bones of the martyrs and insert them in the altar of the local church. One wonders if the cremated remains in the stone circles at Drombeg, Bernog, Renniskrina in County Cork, as well as Cashel Kilty in County Kerry, were dedications in the same manner. It is noticed also in the excavated stone circles of Rinascrina and Bonag that they contain soil-filled pits. Was this a sample of rich soil, a sample of the kind of rich fertile land the worshippers wanted to provide abundant harvests and fat healthy cattle? In other words, the ancestors were in the stone circles to help the people, and the soil sample beside them was a gentle reminder of this, in much the same way as the Christians reminded the saints whose relics were in the altar that they were not there to go to sleep, but to sanctify the place, to bless the people, and to intercede for them with our Lord Jesus Christ. What we are suggesting is an unbroken stream of tradition coming down to us in the Catholic Church from Neolithic times. When the Protestant reformers threw out the altars in favor of the communion table, were they cutting themselves off from the stream of human experience lodged in the collective psyche of mankind? Here in Ireland, in some ways, we have suffered much religious impoverishment through the vicissitudes of history. Many ancient graveyards are to be seen throughout the Irish countryside. Often they are enclosed by a circular wall of earth or stone, and the heaping up of the soil towards the center suggests the innumerable burials which have taken place during the centuries. In the center, the ruins of a medieval church, no doubt often replacing an earlier structure, may be seen. This was the ideal situation. On an important occasion, the Sunday liturgy, the barriers between the living and the dead were seen to be broken down, and the living and the dead formed one united community, as we have suggested happened at the great Celtic festivals of Lugnasa and Samhain, when celebrated at the tombs of the ancestors. Often nowadays, the church stands several miles away from the graveyard, so that this sense of unity with the dead ancestors is forgotten. The Druids preferred yew for wand making over their other favorite woods, apple and oak. The yew tree is extremely long-lived, and when cut down can arise again as the snake sloughs its skin and emerges as a reborn snake. In some cases, we might well wonder if the yews in our ancient graveyards were first planted by Druids. In all of this, I am pointing to the landscape of Ireland. In the landscape, with its megalithic tombs, its stone circles, its rows of standing stones and single pillars, its earthen raths and the osana, natural formations given a religious significance such as the Childanan, the Paps near Killarney, its sacred lakes, rivers, wells, and trees, Christian monuments such as monasteries, churches, graveyards, places of pilgrimage. In all this vast array of phenomena, we see the lingering footmarks of man's quest for the divine from the most remote past to the present day. The Catholic Church, to its credit, has tried to embrace this vast religious experience of mankind within its liturgy. This, of course, is not well understood, and many Christians tend to look down on what they call paganism, forgetting that, for the overwhelming extent of their life on earth, people have been pagans. With this type of mentality, perhaps Jesus himself could be accused of being a pagan. As known from the Gospels, he could read and write, practices invented by the pagans long before the Incarnation. He also wore clothes, a practice made possible by the invention of weaving and the manufacture of cloth from the wool of sheep. This also was the invention of the pagans. Jesus visited the synagogue and temple, but architecture was also the invention of the pagans. In short, Jesus made use of much of what was the common heritage of the surrounding culture as it had evolved over thousands of years. Chapter 5. Goddesses and Gods of Ireland. The sacred kingship among the Celts was concerned with the fertility of the land, with peace and prosperity, and with preserving the order of the universe. In the case of Échad mac Éirc, he was married to the goddess Tail, from which we get Elten in County Meath. But whatever her local name might be, the king was married essentially to Eru. The goddess Eru, who gives her name to the country, is the land of Ireland. She is the great mother who makes the grass grow, the corn ripen, who puts apples on the trees, fish in the rivers, the nourishing mother of her people. According to the legend of Lev Gala Éireann, Clonmeal, on entering the country, first met the goddess Banba of the mystic race of the Tuatha Danann. They spoke to her, and she agreed that they could take possession of the land if it were called by her name. They agreed, and in bardic poetry the country is frequently referred to as Banba. From Siami in Kerry, where they had met Banba, they journeyed on until they came to Sliabhain, Pelim, on the borders of Limerick and Tipperary. There they met the second of the three goddesses, Folla. Again, she agreed to let them have the country if it were known by her name. They agreed, and likewise in bardic poetry, the island is known as Folla. Finally, they arrived at the hill of Isnig, the very center of the country, and here they met Eru. She gave them the greatest welcome of all, and they said that Eru would be the principal name of the country forever. The husbands of the three goddesses, Macal, Macate, and Magrain, however, were not quite as accommodating to the newcomers as their wives were, and a great battle between the Tuatha Danann and Clonmeal, the Celtic invaders, took place at Telton in County Meath. This is probably Sliabhain Loughcrew, the great megalithic cemetery near Kells or modern Teltown. At any rate, the end of the battle was rather indecisive, and both parties, the human Celts and the supernatural Tuatha Danann, decided to divide the country between them. Naturally, one would think that they would have drawn a line from modern Dublin to Galway and assigned one half to the humans and the other half to the divine race. This, however, was not what was done. Each party took the whole of the country. The humans took the surface of the land, where we are, and the Tuatha Danann descended underground into the sheath, the hollow hills and megalithic sites throughout the country. In these sacred sites, such as Brunabon, Newgrain, Sliabhain, Shemore, Shebig, Knockane, Loughgur, Knoxiuna, Carrick-Clona, which dot the Irish countryside, the divine race of the Tuatha Danann continue their supernatural life underground. They are normally invisible, but can make themselves visible on occasion, as when people claim to bear the Banshee, the woman of the She, or sacred hollow hill, or have seen her combing her long red hair. In folk tradition, it is unlucky to pick up a comb from the wayside, as it might be the property of a Banshee who dropped it on her way to wail on the death of somebody descended from true Gaelic or Norman aristocracy. The She is the sacred hill or site, and the Tuatha Danann are often called Aushi, the inhabitants of the She. The same Tuatha Danann or Tuatha Annan, peoples of the goddess Dana, is arrived from Dana or Anna. The D or De may have come over in front of Anna to make it Dana for ease of pronunciation. In any case, Cormac MacCullonan, the great 10th century Archbishop of Cashel and King of Munster, described Anna as Mater Derum Hibernicaeum, mother of the Irish gods. In his celebrated Dictionary of Difficult or Obsolete Words, Sanus Cormac, Stokes, 1862, the special connection of Anna with Munster and with the fertility of the land is pointed out in a manuscript in Trinity College, Dublin. Munster, greater her Anna, prosperity, fertility, than any other province, because it is in her, Munster, is adored, the goddess of fertility, and her name is Anna, and it is her that Dachiok Annan, the two breasts of Anna, is derived. The author is making use of a pun. Anna is the word for prosperity, fertility, and Anna is the name of the goddess of fertility. Dachiok Annan are the two great breast-like hills, the Paps, with a cairn on top of each, which dominate the landscape between Rathmore and Killarney. There the Great Mother is outlined in all her glory, and what a magnificent and evocative sight that is. What a mighty religious symbol this must have been, the primordial woman in her nurturing aspect. Even today, Dachiok Annan draws us back past recorded time to the primordial womb, the nurturing breasts, the protecting and folding arms of the Great Mother. here is mystery and awe. It is natural enough to assume that the Chua de Danann, having been forced underground, would have lost much of their significance. A hilarious passage in the tract, De Gabel in She, in the Book of Leinster, however, contradicts this assumption. Hardly had the Chua de Danann gone underground than they caused the harvest of milk, ith agus blight, to fail. Then the human population, who had ostensibly won the battle of Teltian, had to go hat in hand, as it were, to the Chua de Danann, asking them to restore the crops. The Dagda, their king, was most gracious and agreed to restore the fertility of the land. There was a famous king over the Chua de Danann in Eru, Dagan. The great Dagda was his name. Great was his power, however, even over the sons of Mile, when they had conquered the country, for the Chua de destroyed the corn and milk of Clan Meal. They made a treaty with the Dagda. He gave the corn and milk back to them after this. The great god of the sea, Manan MacLear, who gives his name to the Isle of Man, takes over the leadership of the Chua de Danann, and it is he who divides the supernatural mansions called the She among the princes of the Chua de Danann and their households. Among those names are Boidig, who takes over the fairy mansion of the She Bid Dear Loch Dear Dirk on the Shannon. Mithir is appointed to She Trium near Slane, and Finbar goes to She Mead in County Galway. In this way, the supernatural race of the Chua de Danann, or as She, are spread throughout the country, living in the hollow hills, still venerated as sacred places after the lapse of thousands of years. Map and list of sites in Logan P., The Old Gods, Belfast, 1981. These sacred dwellings are modeled on Manan's own mansion in Imhen Ablach, or Avalon. The Chua de Danann have three great treasures: the Filfad, or supernatural cloak of invisibility, by which they are generally invisible to the human population, but they can on occasion make themselves visible. Sigibnian, the supernatural drink provided by the blacksmith god Gobnu, Gofanan, Gobanshar, by which death and old age were avoided by Chua de Danann. Mukmanan, the pigs of Manan MacLear, which provided unending food. Those killed and cooked today would be alive again tomorrow. Manan is accepted as king of Chua de Danann and is invited to each Shebrew in turn for a great feast, and a flourishing social life develops among this mystic race. What we have then in this country is two population groups, one human living on the surface of the land, ourselves, the other divine, immortal, usually invisible, living in the She or hollow hills and ancient monuments. There is a constant interchange between these two groups. The divine race of Chua de Danann control the fertility of the land, and they expect the human inhabitants on the surface of the land to acknowledge this by making offerings to them. If these offerings are not made, then the Chua de Danann can cause bad harvests and general misfortune on the land. In general, we can say that these offerings take two forms, formal and informal. Formal, offerings made to children or adults going around collecting in mass bands at Samhain, killing of a cock and sprinkling its blood on the threshold and four corners of the house on St. Martin's Eve, 11th of November, Samhain, leaving cakes at sacred sites at sacred times, example Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, Lunasa, burying a sheaf of corn on a Lunasa hill, offerings in a pit, eggs and meat to Don Firin, the Irish god of the dead, the Benis Rei, in which the king is married to the Chua de Danann goddess to ensure the fertility of the dead. Informal, when milking a cow, the first drops are poured on the ground, marking the side of cow with sign of cross made by the thumb dipped in milk, two religions mixed. The first milk of a newly calved cow is poured out at a Baal sacred tree, Leos or other sacred site. 3 potatoes taken from pot at lunchtime and laid aside for Chua de Danann. A slice of bread which drops on floor is laid aside for Chua de Danann. Not an accident, but a hint from Chua de Danann that offering is required. Similarly, in the case of a bucket of milk spilt by a kicking cow, Chua de Danann prompt the cow to spill the milk. A patch of vegetable garden left unharvested, meal left on the table table at All Souls Night, Samhain, for the return of the hungry dead, asking house planning permission from Chuedadan, 4 posts with ropes left from some time on the site. If untouched, build. If knocked down, move where else as the site is on a Chuedadan path. There are many other observances which form part of the Kredev Shi, in which we can only allude to here. Practices such as the use of iron as a protection against harm from Chuedadan, the horseshoe over the door, the throngs in the cradle, the Skian Questive, black-handed knife, the Linanshi, or fairy lover, the Banshee, who cries at the death of a member of the Gaelic aristocracy, the various traditions of skill in music and medicine being given to humans by the Ishi, stories of supernatural animals coming from the sea, the 4 great Celtic feasts of Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lunasa, celebrating the yearly life cycle of the goddess. Literature, folklore, and archaeological remains all indicate that the early founders of Christianity in Ireland, such as Columkill, had to contend with a sophisticated and mystical religion well integrated with the political and social system. The underground race, then, has a stranglehold over the settled population. As they control the fertility of the soil, they have to be placated by little offerings, such as a barren break or loaf laid at the foot of the Shi, respect for their sacred sites which must not be tampered with. This latter has served to preserve the sites intact in many cases to the present day, but the decline of the Kredev Shi, or fairy faith, has led to much destruction. Much of the folklore tradition of Ireland concerns the relations between the Chuedadan and the human population. Tales of the Banshee, or the Linanshi, or fairy lover, abound. Otherworld figures emerge from the Shi, especially at Samhain and Beltane, which are particularly dangerous times. The various traditions have been collected and presented in a masterly fashion by Dr. Patrick Logan in his book The Old Gods, Belfast, 1981. The Chuedadan, or Ishi, are the ancient goddesses and gods of the Celts of Ireland, but there may be among them older divinities from the megalithic period, while Celtic names such as Andagda, the good god, Angus Og, Anboin, Nivir, Manon MacLear, Etne, and others cluster around Brunaboyne. Newgrange itself was constructed thousands of years before the Celts arrived in Ireland. Did the Celtic gods and goddesses take over the sanctuaries of the megalithic peoples as acts of conquest, or was there a blending of different cultures, megalithic, Bronze Age, and Celtic? This would seem to be what happened, and perhaps the different peoples had many religious ideas in common. Then it seems from the folklore traditions of Techdwan off the coast of Kerry and Knockfearin near Croom, County Limerick, that the dead were also involved with the Chuedadan. The Famore, or dark gods of the sea, whom the Chuedadan defeated at the Battle of Megturev, were another group of divinities of immense power. The fairy faith. The Kredev Shi, or fairy faith, was a highly complex religious system. It was above all a fertility cult concerned with food production, health, protection, good harvests, children, large herds of cattle, sheep and pigs. It stood for the ultimately basic things of human life, food and children, the survival of the individual and the survival of the race. While Christianity has during its history shown a marked tendency to become involved in abstruse theological discussions and dogmatic formulations, the Kredev Shi was primarily concerned with putting bread and butter on the table, with the secrets of nature and herbs to provide health and well-being, with good law to produce a stable society. In a pre-technological age, a succession of bad harvests could decimate a community, and so it was all important to preserve good relations with the goddess and the Chuedadan in general, in order to secure the fertility of the land, humans, and agricultural stock. We have a fine account of the cult of the goddess, Ein Clych of Loughgur and Knockane in East Limerick at the end of the 19th century by a local man, David Fitzgerald, whose family were, according to legend, one of the local families actually descended from the goddess. The ritual in honor of Ain took place out of doors on the sacred hill of Knockane near Ospedale Ain. The remains of the Knights Hospitaller Church is beside the Catholic church in the village at a significant astronomical date, the eve of the summer solstice, 23rd of June, St. John's Eve. A torchlight procession encircled the hill, Deshiel, and on reaching the top, went around the moat near the large earthworks there. The clears or torches were then taken and waved among the cattle and fields to communicate the cleansing, fertilizing fire to the crops and animals. Behind the ritual was the belief that Ain returned annually on the holy night to celebrate her own rites. This belief also formed a major part of the cult of St. Brede and is mentioned several times in the manuscripts of the Department of Irish Folklore, University College Dublin. People believe that St. Brede comes at night time and blesses the ribbon on handkerchief. The door was never locked when they were going to bed on that night so that St. Brede might come in and warm herself at the fire, which is left lighting all night. In olden times, the cross was put outside the door on St. Brede's Eve. This was a profession of faith. St. Brede was supposed to pass through Ireland on that night, and she blessed the houses where the cross was displayed. It is believed that St. Brede visits every house on the night of the eve of her feast day. She is supposed to kneel in the doorway and pray for the people of the house. Brede returned then on the 31st of January, the eve of Imbolc, the regular annual return of a saint from heaven to earth on her feast day does not seem to be part of the ordinary Catholic tradition. In the case of St. Brede, it would appear that this was one of the characteristics of the goddess Brede, which descended to breed the saint on analogy with the annual return of Ain. Another element to be noted in this remarkable account is the allusion to the position of the moon. Ain is sometimes to be seen, half her body above the waters, on the bosom of Loughgur, combing her hair, as the Earl of Desmond beheld her by the bank of the Camog. The commoner account is that she dwells within the hill which bears her name, and on which she has often been seen. Every St. John's night, the men used to gather on the hill from all quarters. They were formed in ranks by the old man called Quinlan, whose family, yet 1876, live on the hill, and clears bunches, that is, of straw and hay tied upon poles and lit, were carried in procession round the hill and the little moat on the summit, Mulla Crocain, Lablalib, and Cheer, the hillock top near the grave of the three. Afterwards, people ran through the cultivated fields and among the cattle, waving these clears, which brought luck to crops and beasts for the following year. There was this about the night of the clears, that if you came, say, from some neighboring village to join in the sport, it was necessary that on getting on the hill you should look at the moon and mark what her position was in regard to the place to which you had to return. Otherwise, you would lose your way when the clears were out, and you had to get back home in the darkness. One St. John's night it happened that one of the neighbors lay dead, and on this account the usual clears were not lit. Not lit, I should say, by the hands of living men, for that night such a procession of clears marched round Knock Ain as never was seen before, and Ain herself was seen in the front, directing and ordering everything. On another St. John's night, a number of girls had stayed late on the hill, watching the clears and joining in the games. Suddenly Ain appeared among them, thanked them for the honor that they had done her, but said that now she wished them to go home, as they wanted the hill to themselves. She let them understand whom she meant by they, for calling some of the girls, she made them look through a ring. Then behold, the hill appeared crowded with people, before invisible. Another time she came one night into the house of some people whose friends are yet living, at one end of the hill, and brought them a sheep. So long as the family kept this animal, luck remained joined with them, and when they parted with it, luck abandoned them. Ain is spoken of as the best-hearted woman that ever lived, and the oldest families about Knockcaney are proud to claim descent from her. These Sliach Ain, descendants of Ain, include the O'Briens, Dillons, Creeds, Laffins, O'Days. We must add Fitzgeralds, what few remain thereabouts. The meadow sweet, or queen of the meadow, is thought to be Ain's plant, and to owe to her its fragrant odor. Midsummer fires are known in many parts of Europe and in North Africa. At the summer solstice, the sun has reached its zenith to mark the longest day of the year, but from that point onwards it begins to decline, so that the nights grow longer and the days shorter. The bonfires and fire rituals may be a way of strengthening the declining sun and encouraging it to keep going, so that the harvest in the more northern parts of Europe might ripen. Ain, the fiery driver, is undoubtedly connected with the sun, so that the ritual performed by the people could be considered as a joint effort to assist Ain in her cosmic circuit, which had repercussions in the livelihood of the local population. In David Fitzgerald's description of the rite, there is no reference to St. John. The midsummer fire rituals probably go back to a period long before the Christian era, Fraser 1923, page 622, but were given a Christian slant by attaching the feast of St. John the Baptist to them. At the other side of County Limerick, West Limerick, the bonfire was known as the Chinfil Ain, and prayers were said for the crops and fine weather. In Ethia Parish, the parish priest in the early 19th century attended the bonfire and led the prayers. Danaher, 1972, pages 134 through 135. In Knockcaney, however, Ain prevailed with apparently no great fuss on the part of the church. Knock Ain, of course, stood within the great Loch Gur complex, with its enchanted lake, its profusion of monuments of megalithic and Celtic type, its Norman castles, and the massive folklore surrounding Ain and Jared Airla MacGerald, who was regarded as the human but enchanted son of Ain herself. Nevertheless, it is a curious fact that in the Athia area near the Kerry border, a highly developed ritual prevailed for St. John's Eve, but it seems to have been thoroughly Christianized, and in fact could be said to be a folk version of the Rituale Romanum, whereas at the eastern end of the country on Knock Ain, there seems to have been no attempt at Christianization, and Ain herself was the center of the observance, and invisibility attended the rites celebrated in her honor. While the people of East Limerick were celebrating Ain, and the Ishi, who accompanied her on the sacred hill in the 19th century, centuries before that a cleric was explaining, "Over the land of Ireland there was darkness. The people used to worship the She. They used not to believe in the true divinity of the true Trinity." Liber Hymnorum, Bernard and Atkinson, 1898, page 101. Undoubtedly, there was no lack of faith in the Trinity among the people of East Limerick. To some extent, the ancient Credebshi lived on side by side with the Catholic faith, or certain assimilation took place, a common enough phenomenon when one religion replaces another, and they gradually build up an understanding of each other, the gods and the power of nature. To a degree, perhaps, the ancient gods and goddesses, the Eshi or Dedidweleka, elemental divinities, may be explained as personifications of the forces of nature. One can easily imagine the Ardri or High King standing on the royal hill of Tara and letting his gaze wander over the vast plain of Ireland. In this great undulating, fertile, verdant land expanding before him, how easy it was to see the body of the goddess in all her fruitfulness and variety, a gentle maternal image, she who made the grass grow, who made the corn ripen, who put apples on the trees and acorns on the oaks, the mother of her people. This was Eru. Or one could look at the Boyne River, Anbofin, the white cow, symbol of fertility, and again see in its gentle undulating form the image of the goddess, the giver of salmon. Standing on a cliff overlooking the raging sea, a person might gaze at the swirling waves topped by great crests of white foam rolling along on the surface of the ocean to crash against the strand. He might well see in this vast and threatening panorama the divine figure of the sea, God Manon MacLear, driving his chariot with breakneck speed as the manes of his white horses toss to and fro with the speed of their galloping. From the end of the 19th century, we have an example of this type of personification recorded from the people on the northern slope of Knockfearin near Croom County, Limerick. Knockfearin is the sanctuary of Donfearin, the god of the dead in Irish tradition, no doubt corresponding to Caesar's Dios Pater, from whom, according to Caesar, the Celts maintained they were descended. But Don was also associated with storms, weather prediction, fertility of the land, and general luck to those who reverenced him. Liam O'Daniker, the folklore collector, took down the following conversation between Pat O'Riordan and Mrs. Higgins on a stormy October night. Pat: "One may say that Don is galloping in the clouds tonight." Mrs. H: "Do you hear him now screaming loudly in the wind, a poison note in his sad voice? Listen to that. Listen to that. That's him with ill-tempered mouth and glowering eye. God between us and harm. He's aflame with anger." While the interpretation of the forces of nature as living and acting personality may be an imaginative and poetic projection of the mind, the actual power of nature is real. The storm is real. The power of the land to produce vegetation and crops is real. The power of humans and animals and birds to reproduce themselves is real, along with thousands of other mysterious activities of the elements. In adopting a sophisticated, superior, and rationalistic attitude towards the old gods, one risks drifting into a cold, stony mentality, boring and lifeless. In the account of St. Patrick's meeting with the two daughters of King Lochar at the well of Cleibach near Rathcrogan, County Roscommon, we get a very intimate view of the several facets of early Irish Christianity. The princesses, Edne and Fedel, come to the well to bathe. Attention is drawn to the east and the rising sun, which, with the water, indicate the baptismal theme described later. Then there is the strange episode in which St. Patrick and his clerics, dressed in white, are actually mistaken for the Aushi or Chuadidanan. Then there is the dialogue between the representatives of the two religions, in which the powers of nature and the elemental gods are discussed, and the resolution is arrived at in which the multitude of terrestrial divinities are resolved into the one God. The princesses are converted and respond to the creed, which precedes baptism. They are then baptized in the well of Cleibach, now Augula near Tulsk, and then asked to see the Lord. St. Patrick assures them that they must receive the Eucharist and die before seeing the face of God. They agree, receive the Eucharist, which for them, as with the children of Lear in the old legend, is a viaticum, or bread for the journey, and straightway die. The Key Nave, or Lament for the Dead, is sung for them, and they are buried by the well. It becomes a place of pilgrimage for the faithful who visit it on the last Sunday in June. In Tirek Khan's account, we have a moving description of the meeting of the two faiths in a gentle way, devoid of the arrogance which so often characterizes these occasions. The story of Patrick and the royal daughters. But thence went the holy Patrick to the spring which is called Cleibach on the sides of Crochan before the rising of the sun, and they sat beside the spring. And behold, two daughters of Lager, Etne the fair, and Fedem the ruddy, came to the spring in the morning, after the custom of women, to wash. And they found a holy synod of bishops with Patrick by the spring, and they did not know from whence they were, or of what shape, or of what people, or of what region. But they thought that they were men of the She, or of the terrestrial gods, or an apparition. And the daughters said to them, Whence are ye, and whence have ye come? And Patrick said to them, It were better that you would confess our true God than to inquire about our race. The first daughter said, Who is God, and where is God? And of what is God? And where is his dwelling place? Has your God sons and daughters, gold and silver? Is he ever living? Is he beautiful? Have many fostered his son? Are his daughters dear and beautiful to the men of the world? Is he in heaven or on earth, in the sea, in the rivers, in the mountains, in the valleys? Tell us, how is he seen? How is he loved? How is he found? Is he in youth or in age? But Holy Patrick, full of the Holy Spirit, answering, said, Our God is the God of all men, the God of heaven and earth, of the sea and of the rivers, the God of the sun and of the moon, of all the stars, the God of the lofty mountains and of the lowly valleys, the God over heaven and in heaven and under heaven. He has his dwelling toward heaven and earth, and the sea, and all things that are in them. He inspires all things. He gives life to all things. He surpasses all things. He supports all things. He kindles the light of the sun. He strengthens the light of the moon at night for watches, and he made springs in the land, and dry islands in the sea, and the stars he placed to minister to the greater lights. He has a Son co-eternal with himself, and like unto himself. The Son is not younger than the Father, nor is the Father older than the Son. The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are not separated. I truly desire to unite you to the heavenly King, since ye are daughters of an earthly king. Believe in him. And the daughters said, as if with one mouth and heart, How can we believe in the heavenly King? Teach us most diligently, so that we may see him face to face. Point out to us, and we will do whatsoever thou shalt say to us. And Patrick said, Do you believe that the sin of your father and mother is taken away by baptism? They replied, We do believe it. Patrick, do you believe there is repentance after sin? Daughters, we do believe it. Patrick, do you believe there is a life after death? Do you believe in the resurrection on the day of judgment? Daughters, we do believe it. Patrick, do you believe in the unity of the church? Daughters, we do believe it. And they were baptized, and Patrick placed a white garment on their heads, and they begged to see the face of Christ. And the saint said to them, Unless you shall have tasted death, you cannot see the face of Christ, and unless you shall receive the sacrifice. And they replied, Give to us the sacrifice, that we may see the Son, our spouse. And they received the Eucharist of God, and they slept in death. And they placed them in a bed covered with one mantle, and their friends made a wailing and a great lamentation. And the days of the wailing for the daughters of the king were ended, and they buried them by the king Clamach. And they made a round ditch in the likeness of a grave, because so the Scotic men and Gentiles used to do. Sanderson, 1875, pages 79 to 282. Chuedadan and the Fallen Angels. From quite an early period, as is seen from Le Bargavala Erin, the Irish embarked on an imaginative effort to situate the Chuedadan within the boundaries of Christian theology. Fundamentally, among some, the Chuedadan, or Eoshi, were identified with the rebellious angels who rebelled against God in heaven. They were led by Lucifer the dragon, and defeated by the good angels led by Saint Michael, and cast out of heaven, as recorded in the book of the Apocalypse, chapter 12. This war in heaven seems to have been very important to the Irish from the theological point of view, and had a large influence in the conception of Christian life on earth. The Lebar Gavala stresses that there were various opinions on the origins of the Chuedadan, and it is evident that a great deal of creative thinking was going on at this early period. Other people say that the Chuedadan were demons of a different grade, and that it is they who came from heaven, along with the expulsion by which Lucifer and his demons came from heaven, having taken an airy body upon themselves to destroy and to tempt the seed of Adam. Here is a clear and cogent connection between the rebellion and war in heaven, the heavenly sphere, and the Christian life on earth. The earthly, Lucifer and the rebellious angels who made war on God and heaven are defeated and, as it were, deported, cast out of heaven down to earth. But in their new home on earth, they do not remain inactive. They begin the war against God all over again by attacking and tempting the descendants of Adam, the human race.